Welcome to the Adaptation Dialogues for Africa, building on Glasgow to co-create solutions for COP27. This is the third dialogue on strengthening climate resilience of infrastructure in Africa. This event is being translated in French. So on your Zoom call, you will see a globe icon. It will let you choose the language of your preference. We have just French and English for now. And we're really looking forward to all your participation. So please do post all your questions on the Q&A box and not on the chat box. You can use the chat box to introduce yourself or to discuss specific topics. Without further delay, I welcome Mr. Nitin Jain, Global Programs Lead for Infrastructure and Nature-Based Solutions, to chair this dialogue. Over to Nitin.
Thank you, Priya. And good morning, everyone, or afternoon, as the case may be. I'm very pleased to join you from Dakar, Senegal, and welcome you to the third in the series of Africa Adaptation Dialogues, launched by the Global Center on Adaptation in partnership with the UK COP presidency. My name is Nitin Jain, and I serve as the Global Lead for Infrastructure and Nature-Based Solutions at GCA. My role today is to help facilitate this dialogue on the topic of strengthening the resilience of infrastructure in Africa. It's worth starting by taking a step back to assess why we're here today. The latest IPCC report highlights the reality of a world that will be on average 1.5 degrees warmer by 2030. In Africa, despite contributing very little to the underlying causes of climate change, the average temperature will be even higher. The consequences of exposure to these hazards will have very tangible impacts on people, communities, businesses, and the economy. Prior to joining GCA, I lived and worked in Freetown, Sierra Leone, where there are parts of the country where you can literally see the impacts of climate change on fishing communities, for example, that rely on the ocean for livelihoods. But these climate hazards are starting to squeeze their homes and their communities, forcing them to relocate each year. GCA was established to help countries and communities address and adapt to these climate challenges. In Africa, GCA's strategy is implemented through the ambitious $25 billion Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, the AAAP. AAAP was launched by our CEO, Professor Patrick Verkooyen, and the African Development Bank President, Adesina, at the Climate Adaptation Summit last year. In its first year, AAAP has shaped climate adaptation responses within a $1 billion pipeline of investments of the African Development Bank. These investments are in four areas, or four pillars of AAAP, which include food security, resilient infrastructure, climate finance, and youth employment. In 2022, we're already racing to scale this up further. Within this context, in 2021, GCA launched its second annual State and Trends on Adaptation report for Africa. The report was launched by our CEO with President Kenyatta at Nairobi University in 2021. And I wanted to highlight one key message from the report, which is that investments in adapting to climate change not only save lives, but it makes economic sense. Now, these investments do, of course, cost money, but the cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of action. This insight provides the foundation for AAAP and for the dialogue today, where we aim to explore how the public sector, the private sector, and the international development community can collaborate through vehicles such as the AAAP to scale up investments in resilient infrastructure in Africa. One of the key themes we want to explore today is how we can ensure that investments in resilient infrastructure assets translate into resilient services that are delivered through these infrastructure assets. These services, for example, can include access to markets for farmers, access to energy for businesses, and access to basic services such as healthcare and education for people. So let me pause over there and turn to our distinguished panel of experts to lead this discussion today. I'm very pleased and honored to introduce, starting with Professor Jim Hall, joining us from the UK, who will be providing the framing remarks that draw from the State and Trends report, and of course his extensive experience in infrastructure resilience for the discussion today. Professor Hall is the Director of Research in the School of Geography and Environment at University of Oxford and is a close partner of GCA. Dr. Monica Altamirano, who's a partner and lead for the public-private partnerships practice at Now Partners. Dr. Altamirano was a compelling speaker and a partner at GCA's Climate Adaptation Summit last year. So we're pleased to welcome her back to share from her experience on climate resilient infrastructure PPPs and nature-based solutions. Mr. Richard Abel is the Managing Director for Climate Investments at Macquarie Group. Macquarie is, of course, one of the largest private infrastructure asset investors globally. So we will turn to you to bring an investor's lens to the dialogue today. Dr. Linus Mofor, Senior Environmental Affairs Officer on Energy, Infrastructure and Climate Change at the UN Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA. Dr. Mofor's work has focused on energy and resilient infrastructure in support of low carbon development in Africa. And he will speak more on the gaps that need to be bridged in the enabling environment to support adaptation and resilience. And finally, Mr. Mohammed Nabu, Director of the Climate, Biodiversity and Food Systems Department at the United Cities and Local Government for Africa. UCLG's membership represents 350 million Africans. So while we don't want to put too much pressure on you, sir, it is fair to say that your words will carry a lot of significance in our discussions today. With that, let me hand over to Professor Hall.
Thank you very much indeed, Nitin, and thank you for the invitation to join this important dialogue on the importance of infrastructure in adaptation. And let me begin just by underlining some possibly rather obvious facts about why infrastructure is so important in the context of adapting to climate change. The first being that infrastructure is disproportionately exposed to the impacts of climate change, just by virtue of where we build cities and ports and hydropower reservoirs and water treatment works and water supply. Is all in places where we know that the impacts of climate change are going to get worse. The second point is that infrastructure decisions, in particular where we put infrastructure, how we design it, how we interconnect it, lock in vulnerabilities and patterns of development for years to come, sometimes decades. So the choices we make now about infrastructure are absolutely fundamental to the climate risks which we're going to face in the future. And nowhere more so than in Africa, where estimates are that 70% of the infrastructure that Africa needs has yet to be built. So there are really crucial choices to be made about the location and nature of infrastructure in Africa. And finally, and let me begin to share my screen to illustrate this, the other reason why we're so concerned about infrastructure in relation to climate change is because infrastructure is so important in delivering essential services which people need. Nitin referred to the Statement Trends in Adaptation report 2021. This image was used in it. Actually, it was originally done by my team and my colleague Scott Thacker, which illustrates the essential role of infrastructure in contributing to achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, in providing essential services for people, the economy, and indeed the environment. So infrastructure should be and is top of the agenda for adaptation. The very alarming news from that State and Trends report, this figure also comes from that, is what if there is not the adaptation and indeed the mitigation that we were working for in Glasgow and will work for again in Sharm el-Sheikh this year, is the scale of the climate impacts in Africa which are anticipated. So there is a real urgent need to look at the scale of infrastructure investment that is taking place and make sure that the right choices are made straight away. The issue is that making adaptation choices in infrastructure is not straightforward. Nitin referred to some of the economic benefits that can be achieved through reducing climate risks, and those benefits certainly are there to be had. However, It's also very easy to waste adaptation finance. And so it's really crucial that investments are well targeted, that one begins with a strategic systems view of what are the needs for infrastructure services, what are the climate threats, and then how those systems can be adapted. And Nitin referred to the Ghana infrastructure pathway project, which was just launched last week, which took that kind of systematic approach, looking across the built environment, the natural environment, and indeed the institutional enabling environment to understand what are the threats from climate change, but then what are the adaptation options? How can those be prioritized into a strategy, which then becomes financeable? And how do elements of that strategy match up with financing opportunities? Just to show a couple of snapshots from this very briefly, the starting point is understanding exposure to a range of climate-related hazards. And there are real opportunities these days with high-resolution mapping and analysis to pinpoint where the hotspots of climate risk are and use that to prioritize adaptation actions. And then to look at each of those adaptation actions, what's coming up in terms of future infrastructure investments, how exposed might they be to climate threats, and what are the opportunities through careful location, through regulations and design standards, through building resilient networks, through understanding the role of nature and nature-based solutions. How can all of those things be made more resilient in the future? And where the Ghana study led to was a prioritized set of interventions, 35 different possible infrastructure interventions, summarized very clearly in a way which then led forward into the possibilities of finance, matching infrastructure projects, resilient infrastructure projects, to a whole range of different finance sources so in order to create a project pipeline of bankable projects which also contribute to infrastructure resilience. That was in Ghana. The types of analytics and techniques which were developed there are utterly scalable. This is the journey we're on towards COP27, is to provide this type of capability for resilient infrastructure prioritization everywhere in Africa. And I'll leave it there and pass over to my colleague.
Thank you, Jim. So one of the things that I heard repeated a few times is the need to prioritize, and the reasons for that are clear. It's just we cannot afford to make every single asset 100% resilient. Prioritizing which assets we invest in is the starting point, and that requires data, that requires analytics, that requires planning, and bringing in other stakeholders into that process. So let me then open this up for the panel discussion, where we want to explore the question of how do we ensure that resilient infrastructure is mainstreamed, and how investments in resilient assets translate into resilient services. So starting with Dr. Monica Altamirano, mainstreaming climate resilience in infrastructure requires actions and leadership from the public sector, clearly. But the private sector also has a role to play. Public-private partnerships offer one mechanism for structuring these partnerships. But what is the role of the private sector in this? And is there a role for PPPs in scaling up climate resilient infrastructure? And what advantages do these instruments bring?
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you for this question. Well, I think definitely there is a role for private sector, and I think I would like to use actually the image that somebody, a private sector leader, gave during World Water Forum last week, and that's like, in a way, private sector, because of the incentives that it has, it's like the motor, right? So as a public sector, we may give direction to where they should go, but keep things going, the intrinsic incentives from private sector to are key. So if we visualize it like that, then I think the point is, how do we make sure this motor is working in the... Hello, sorry, I had a little technical problem. Is working in the right direction. So, and if we look at Africa and at the report you just launched, we see a number. I would like to put 3 numbers and then go into how they can play a role, right? And one is like, there are only, I mean, we need like 331 billion of investments in the region, right, to adapt. Only 30 are getting there, and most of them are public resources. In a lot of other studies also, people expect private sector to play around 85 or at least 75% of these gaps in investments. And also, if we look at Africa, 90% of the jobs are created by the private sector and 75% of the economic output. So the role that the private sector has in all these sectors is crucial. We see it by the numbers. Now, how do we get them to invest in resilience, right? And to adapt? In that sense, that is where public-private partnerships play a crucial role, because I think concessive and non-concessive ones may be the second, very important to get them started. Because first, I mean, these contracts are like having a whole of a life cycle approach. So they will also ensuring continuity in service provision, as Professor Jim Ho was telling us. And the second is that by the way we design them, we can create already clear incentives for design, operation, and maintenance for these infrastructures to be resilient, right? And it's a whole art, it's not so simple. And that is where we believe that it's very important that we raise the knowledge on the design of public-private partnerships in all these countries, right? Because you do need an enabling environment and a regulatory framework that makes that we make the most use out of it. If I would have to be very, maybe very clear in how do we get that started, we need much earlier private sector engagement, because for have that motor working in the right way, we need to make them part earlier in the process. We need also more variety of contracts, because I think most of the time we're only looking, for example, a build, operate, transfer, or super concessive models, and we need to start with models that allow us to blend different types of finance. There are certainly advances, and just to close, for example, in the UK, you have the Broadland Flood Alleviation Project that is 200 kilometers of flood defenses, right? In the middle of a wetland. So it's already including nature-based solutions, and it's a 20-year project that has worked out. So there are models out there that we just need, I think, to start to learn from and implement. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. So if I may draw Richard into the discussion, Jim highlighted the need to prioritize adaptation investments by assessing systemic risk of these interconnected infrastructure networks. But the solutions ultimately require working at the asset level. Now, Macquarie is a major private investor in infrastructure assets. So from your perspective, what are the barriers that you see in ensuring that investments in these assets are climate resilient? And particularly within the context where we hear that there's benefits to these investments. So what do we need to do to then scale up the investments?
Thanks. So I would, I think that having greater awareness and better data about the nature of the risks in a particular environment that need to be prioritized is, as Jim highlighted, very important, because look, the supply of capital or to pay for, someone's got to pay for these improvements. And while the financing may come from the private sector, ultimately it has to be remunerated through either government or public authority or consumers paying for the use of the building and use of the infrastructure, potentially over a long period of time in a PPP, or sometimes upfront, or through a regulated asset-based model, for example, which is a sort of more kind of almost like perpetual form of regulation for long-dated infrastructure assets. So someone's got to pay, so better prioritize the stuff that has provides best protection for the key risks. And they will be different in different places. So in Finland, we own a large part of the electricity network. There, the key climate adaptation risk is more severe winter storms bringing down overhead electricity lines. So there's a big program of undergrounding, which is expensive, key bits of the electricity transmission and distribution infrastructure. Now that's been allowed by the regulator, so it means that companies can build into it, contractors get up because of scale and reducing the overall costs, because you've got a sort of repeat program that everyone is bought into. So you've got to have the public authorities bought into this. You've got to sort of common consent and then look for scale. And maybe I'd maybe close and say that to mainstream this stuff, Lou, the challenge in Africa for private investors is not enough infrastructure to invest in. We understand why, because of the fiscal constraints. But part of the problem is even when people are keen to move ahead and there may be sufficient financing support from the international community and national governments and municipalities themselves, there's a lack of repeat programs, which is what you need to get the lawyers, to get the bankers, to get the developers and the investors, like fund managers, really engaged and wanting to work hard at it. So in South Africa, the renewable energy program, which is obviously a mitigation rather than adaptation strategy, it's really the only example of a repeat program in renewable energy in Africa, which has attracted capital in and attracted all that whole investment, private sector investment infrastructure, precisely because it is scalable, repeatable, understandable, well run. And so people think, well, it's worth us creating a team to keep going after these bids and stay with the program, because it's not a one-off and it's not something that's going to take 3 or 4 years to come to even anything happening. So there's some more generic points there, which we can maybe explore, but also the data and everyone being bought into the resilience priorities is definitely a part of it once we get to the starting base of making investments in infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Very, very interesting insight. We have consistently been hearing the need for the partnership element in the PPP. So it's public and private partnerships. One can't do it without the other. Dr. Linus, I wanted to then come to you perhaps on that point. So while this drive for investment from public and private individually is critical, there are other factors that either support or hinder the integration of climate resilience into infrastructure planning and financing. So what are, from your experience, solutions to building a conducive enabling environment to facilitate these infrastructure investments and to facilitate the sort of challenges that Richard had raised on repeatable investment programs and things and programs that can operate at some scale?
No, thank you very much, Nitin, and thanks to GCA for inviting us to be part of this very important, interesting conversation on building resilience in Africa. Yeah, as colleagues have mentioned, and Richard just mentioned, there's not enough infrastructure for investment, but the gap is so huge. And this presents Africa with a challenge and an opportunity. Right, the challenge is how do you then create the enabling environment for the investments to happen for you to close the infrastructure deficit quickly enough. But it gives you the opportunity in the sense that starting from a very low base, you can do it right and do it in a way that you build resilience right from the beginning, unlike in other places where you have to retrofit resilience. And this becomes really important. And I think when you do that, when you have the capacity to do that integration of resilience in those investments, it can then happen because at the moment there's one side where the investors who have the money to invest feel scared that without action on climate change, if they bring their huge monies to put in infrastructure in Africa, they could become stranded assets because of the lack of resilience. But then if there is confidence that the infrastructure will perform in today and tomorrow's climate, then the investments will flow and help Africa to close the gap. So Africa is actually in a very unique position where it can attract the financing that is needed to close the infrastructure gap, but the capacity to do so is very much lacking on the continent. The data to do that is very much lacking on the continent. And that is why we at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the World Bank, the African Union Commission, and the African Development Bank, and with support now also from the GCA, started this thing called the Africa Climate Resilient Investment Facility, basically saying that how can we support right at the project level, integration of resilience into project design? How can we build capacity on the continent and promote advocacy for integration of climate resilience across the continent, across the countries? And how can we also share good practice? How can we learn from resilience building elsewhere and also in some of the projects that have already happened on the continent? And then again, Professor Hall, Richard, and Monica, they all mentioned about the need for data and so on. We have data sparsity, but where data exists, it exists in so many different places. So we feel that through the AfriRest portal, we bring together through one window, so to speak, the data that is available or the pointer to where the data is. And hopefully with all of these factors in place, we can have the enabling environment that can build the confidence on how we integrate climate resilience in the investments, not only infrastructure, but agriculture and other areas that have huge development gaps on the continent. And we think that this is something that can really make the investments to happen. And then we have a win-win situation. So this is really critical, having the capacity, the project level support, the knowledge portal, and the sharing of good practice, which we also, again, have to build partnerships beyond what we have now for the AfriRest to make this happen. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Linus. Very interesting points, and particularly picking up on your point that data is scattered, and I would just extend that to data and knowledge and capacity sort of scattered, because climate adaptation is not about one sector. And so bringing that together requires collaboration and partnerships through vehicles such as AAAP. But I then wanted to, I wanted to dive down to the local level. Infrastructure systems are large and often complex, but the services provided through them, or the services demanded from these systems, are planned and delivered at the local level. And so, Mr. Mohammed, if I may ask you, what is the role of local government in Africa in facilitating climate adaptation through resilient infrastructure?
Donc, merci beaucoup pour cette invitation. Donc, effectivement, je m'appelle Monsieur Mohammed, donc je suis responsable des changements climatiques, biodiversité, système alimentaire. Lorsque vous avez évoqué effectivement la question de l'adaptation, l'adaptation est un défi largement territorial, au fait.
Territorialized challenge, and it sets local authorities at the heart of the implementation. Nevertheless, 2 weeks ago, there was the World Forum on Water, and I just would like to quote an issue that was largely debated. And when we speak of water, we speak of themes. 80% of water issues come from are connected to adaptation. A very interesting example, because at this World Forum of Water, the commitment of local authorities is the only guarantee that we may have resilient infrastructure. When we speak of resilience, it means a commitment from several stakeholders on the local area. In Africa, as you must know, the main issue in the implementation of projects has much more to do on the very low level of decentralization, because we operate from the up to the bottom, and we forgot that the local reality is pivotal for the implementation of projects. And when we speak of resilient infrastructure, may it be for roads or for water, on several other basic infrastructure on the local level, if the local authorities are not engaged, they are going to suggest projects are disconnected from local authority, because the local implementation is not anchored locally. We need a straightforward and direct commitment of those local authorities. The attractiveness of local territories and for investors also depend on this commitment of local authorities, and their position in financial structuration is very low. That's why we have a gap to fill as for multi-level governance in Africa, so that we can better structure resilient projects and sustainable projects on a local level.
So to finish, I believe the question of implementation of projects at the local level rests mainly on setting up a favorable environment at different levels, and governance where the challenges at the local level are taken into account very clearly. So in terms of that's what we're doing in our advocacy work at the moment. We're asking for local mayors to be stakeholders in the implementation of resilience projects, because a mayor has several different functions. The mayor has a function to govern, to feed, to set up basic infrastructures, to maintain those infrastructures, and to green Africa. These are the 5 functions a local mayor has. And I thank you very much for hearing me.
Thank you, sir. Very interesting points that I think will actually help shape our strategy under the Global Hub for Locally Led Action, which is implementing programs in Africa within our infrastructure program as well. But I heard you closing with a note on nature. And so coming back to then, Monica, there is increasing evidence that nature-based solutions are a cost-effective strategy and solution for adaptation. And as a sort of common theme in the questions that I'm asking, despite these benefits though, the investments still remain fairly limited and often stop at a pilot stage. So from your perspective and experience, what is the role of nature-based solutions in building climate resilient infrastructure? And how can we scale up these investments in natural assets?
Thank you, Nitin. I'm getting my 2 addictions in the questions, PVPs and nature-based solutions. But so it's an honor to answer this question. And I'd like to start by just reminding us of the 3 top risk identified by the World Economic Forum. And in those top 3, that is, 1 is failure to organize collective climate action, right? And I think we have built that through the partnership part. And biodiversity is another very important one, right? So I think the term nature-based solutions has picked up and is great, but maybe it's important to then go back and remind ourselves that although they look like little spots that we do here and there, right? We're actually talking on the need to improve the health of ecosystems, and that are more like critical infrastructure networks, right? And which we don't see them most of the time, but also reading at your nice report on Africa, we see that I think 5 more times people are affected by droughts, for example, right? And if you see hydrometeorological drought, right? Like just the rain it doesn't need to become a drought and people to experience the effects on it. And that's where ecosystems play a role, right? So can we use investment in nature-based solutions really focus to improve the health of these ecosystems that would act then as buffers, no, against a lot of this climate variability? Of course, they are also subject to climate variability, so we have to become even more and more smart on managing them. So I mean, definitely one part is true. There is a lot of pilots out there, and we kind of try to are failing to scale. At the same time, I think we see the last 5 years such an increase, no, of number of structures that are enabling those investments, like in the biodiversity finance, right? So, and what is missing, I think I would focus on two things, is that we are missing governance structures that make it easier to make collective investments, right? For example, at the watershed or ecosystem level. And the other is a different approach to blended finance. And on the first, we are already seeing examples like the rhino bond that the World Bank put out, where if you increase, if the number of black rhinos in South Africa will increase, the GEF will pay to some investors to do that. So that's a great innovation. And other examples like in Brazil, where through blended finance and a long-term plan, you get a complete new value chain of macaúba, for example, coming on, which is improving the overall health of ecosystems. So there are ways. We do need, I think, to go through more consistent collaboration, global, local, and public-private. As before Richard said, there has to be an idea of a pipeline, no, for people to get going on investing. Thank you.
Thank you. So Richard, coming back to you then, we've heard sort of a few opportunities on where and how investments can be made. But from your perspective as an investor, how do we mainstream resilience into infrastructure investment? And maybe if there's sort of a link on the nature-based solutions side on that, on your response as well.
Start with the infrastructure. And I think the point Monica just made there about the need for a pipeline and common standards is really important. So one good example I would say that is well underway is the EDGE standard. And there's other ones, but EDGE is getting increasingly well known in Africa, developed by the IFC. And it's basically some environmental standards for real estate development. Now, going back to the sort of theme of urbanization and building a lot of this from scratch in Africa, if you can, it's actually it's not very much more expensive to design an EDGE compliant building. So it's got resource efficiency. It's uses as much renewables as possible for energy and for heating and cooling. Design of the sort of, windows and the sort of space and the walls to try and deal with what's expected to be and is already, sort of extremes of temperature in an efficient way. It's actually not that much more expensive to do that from the start. It's much harder to retrofit it. So you can do some retrofitting, but doing it from the start makes a lot of sense. So we, in the fund I run in UK Climate Investments, have cornerstoned an affordable green housing platform in Kenya. And that's exactly, it's designed to incentivize the developers, over-incentivize them to outperform those environmental standards. So that's one example. Follow that standards, well understood. It helps create a pipeline. Developers know what they're doing, and you build it in from the start. Second example would be in solar farms in arid areas, where we have invested in automatic waterless cleaning, recognizing that water stress is going to become an increasing feature going forward. Now, these systems actually pay for themselves over a period. They involve some upfront CapEx. You can retrofit them as well as build them in from the start. Better to build them in from the start on the whole, but they're actually not too bad as a retrofit. So they actually make economic sense, but they're really an adaptation measure, because that water is going to be needed for other social and economic purposes if you look ahead to the 25 plus years life of a solar plant that you're building today. And finally, and briefly on nature, I think we're working at Macquarie, we're working on, because our clients are asking us, we want to find ways of investing in this. Can you develop for us some products, in this space? So while it's early days, we're doing it. We've done it in our agriculture portfolio a bit already, where we've got climate investors now in that. And we're looking at it more broadly and also trying to find a way to value biodiversity. It's going to require global standards as well as some financial innovation, but there's appetite there. So I think I'm cautiously optimistic that this is going to be a more rapidly growing sector than perhaps we think it will be today. Thank you.
Excellent. Good to know that there's demand for this from your clients. Linus, so if you're thinking about the financing of resilience, one of the ways in which we can bring in the money that is required is through the transition in the for mitigation, so in investments in mitigation. So all new mitigation projects do need to be made resilient. And Richard had mentioned solar, for example, and solutions for that. But in your experience, what are the key steps in working towards climate resilience of transitioning infrastructure systems in Africa?
No, thank you again, Nitin. Indeed, this is extremely important, and I think Richard made an important point that when we think about resilience, it's not too expensive, especially when you're starting from afresh, because you have to think long term. And one of the things that the Africa Climate Resilient Investment Facility, which by the way, I forgot to also mention that is supported by the Nordic Development Fund, is the promotion of this notion of resilience dividend, right? That when you are starting from afresh and you integrate resilience now, then there is the more guarantee that you will harness the dividend from that investment for a longer period, for sure. So you can front load that investment or that dividend into making an investment possible at the beginning. But starting at the beginning is really the issue of policy and regulation, right? When I used to live and work in the UK, we did a lot of work on flood risk, right? The government's invested a huge amount of money to produce flood risk maps for the country. Then there was regulation saying that in the case of building houses or for building, and that you couldn't build in certain flood zones, right? And a particular flood zone you could build in it, but then you have to demonstrate that the flood risk is manageable. So that's a very good starting point. And we know that you have other ways through the ESG, where there are a lot of investors, people like Richard and so on, who will say they would only invest in mitigation or other projects going forward if there are environmental, governance, and social tick boxes that you can tick and so on. Those are very, very important. But then I think there's also the issue of saying that from the public perspective, that there has to be recourse in terms of not ensuring that resilience is taken into the implementation of some projects. I give you an example, Nathan. When I was a student, my lecturer, who was a hydrologist, went to court as an expert witness in a case where there was a lady coming back from a party with a boyfriend, had an accident, and because the car skidded over water on a motorway, and she sued the insurance of the boyfriend. She sued the highways authority, and she also sued the local authority because the guy was driving fast. The highways agency didn't design the road properly, because if they designed the road properly, then the water wouldn't have pooled on the road, and then he wouldn't have skidded. And then the local authority that they didn't provide lighting, because even if there was pool water on the road, if the lighting was there, maybe the guy would have seen that there's a pool of water and so on. So these are some of the factors that we can, this type of thinking that we can use to ensure that projects transitioning into a more resilient world can be done that way, right? So we have the policy and regulatory framework, we have the mechanism for recourse, we have the mechanism for incentives in terms of investments. So there are people who want to put their monies only in a type of project that can tick these boxes and so on. And I think all of this put together, and then going back to the point I started with, to say that when you do this, you actually have a better guarantee on the return on investment, is a good framework, I think, on how we can move forward. We can transition to a more climate resilient world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Just by the way, as a side note, I'm seeing that there are some questions coming in the chat. There's also a Q&A box if you can use to post your questions, and there will be time for posting those questions to the panel in a couple of minutes. But just to move on then to Mr. Nabu. So infrastructure resilience is seen or is often implemented through a top-down approach. And so coming back to the point of the need for local representation, local ownership, local decision-making, local data as well, how and what can we do to work together to see a speedy, a rapid transformation in climate resilient infrastructure?
Oui, en tout cas, merci beaucoup. Je m'excuse.
Thank you. I'm sorry about my camera. My Wi-Fi connection is quite weak. So I'd like to come back to nature-based solutions, because there are solutions that through their design have bottom-up built into them, bottom-up approach built into them. It's a reality for local areas. I think in our experience, we led together with several other cities projects based on nature in the area of mangroves, for example, which is a biodiversity heritage that it is very important to protect. Equally, in the Congo Basin, we worked with many local authorities on the issue of forestry, because we shouldn't forget that there, the question of energy and forests cross over. The experience, for example, of Gabon is extremely interesting in as much as it is the country that enabled the forestry, the services rendered by the forest to be valued. So they, by selling greenhouse gas emissions that are absorbed by the forest. And this money was put at the disposal of the local population. So they were able to carry out heating projects and energy projects that were more resilient. So I believe the issue of resilience is an issue that must be taken from bottom up, i.e. the local collective, the local population should be involved from the beginning. This allows us to build in the very basic data to the project so that the projects are in turn resilient and sustainable. And this is in any area, whether it's energy, water, whether it's transport, because taking into account basic data from the beginning enables you to strengthen the resilience of the projects, knowing, as we do at the level of Africa, that we have a fast rising population and urbanization. So being able to control this will enable us to put in place and build into the projects, whether in transports, whether in energy or in the area of water, will enable us to build in basic data that will help us better structure the projects and make them more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, go ahead. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much again. A lot of great insight, and I'm now seeing a number of questions in the Q&A box and in the chat box as well. But I just wanted to highlight that a lot of the points, if I may take off the moderator hat for a minute and just speak from my role as the lead on infrastructure at GCA, a lot of the comments, a lot of the points being highlighted are going to be very helpful as and will help shape our strategy under the Africa Infrastructure Resilience Accelerator, IRA, which is the infrastructure pillar under AAAP. The work in Ghana, for example, that Jim highlighted is focused on working with the government and local stakeholders to prioritize where to invest. So what are the adaptation needs and what are the solutions? We will scale that up in the coming months to other countries as well. And in Ghana now work to actually bring in the investment that is required to implement the roadmap. And then similarly, at the asset level, we have the Public-Private Infrastructure Resilience Accelerator, which is what I referenced earlier with the pipeline of investments with African Development Bank and other MDBs, where we really want to bring in this point that's raised several times today on data from that, assessing, quantifying risk, and from that making and investing in adaptation and resilience investment options. But at the center of all of this, at the center of the AAAP strategy, including for the infrastructure pillar, is partnerships and the need for partnerships, which has been raised again repeatedly throughout the discussions today. So let me just briefly invite GCA's lead on AAAP partnerships to speak, Ms. Amanda Archibong.
Thanks very much, Nitin, for that. As has been said, my name is Amanda Archibong, Senior Programs Officer on the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program here at GCA. Indeed, we've heard from the esteemed panelists here of the issues. 70% of Africa's infrastructure still needs to be built. I think Monica highlighted the financing gap. 300 billion is needed, but 30 billion is only what is available. And so the GCA and African Development Bank collaborate on the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program to focus not only on infrastructure, but as well on agriculture, looking at climate smart agricultural digital innovations, looking as well on youth empowerment and entrepreneurship, and on innovative financial initiatives for Africa. And so the issue is there are many organizations doing innovative, amazing work already on these different issues, projects, activities, programs that are in line with these different focus areas. We want to hear from you. December last year, GCA launched a call for partners to respond to seek to implement as sub-grantees activities under these different pillars. And so this call is targeted basically on non-governmental organizations that are operating and are legally registered in Africa to act as sub-grantees to implement specific activities under these four different focus areas of the AAAP. And so basically how to respond to this, again, I said, if you're a non-governmental organization registered and operating in Africa for about 5 years and above, we would like to hear from you. Send in an expression of interest, a brief expression of interest, outlining your track record and experience and expertise in the specific pillar that you're interested in, as well as the evidence of your being registered and operating in Africa. The details would be put in the chat box, but again, but just to say, it's on the GCA website on the partnerships page. So again, we want to hear from these organizations because there's so many doing interesting and innovative work. So thank you for the opportunity to highlight this. Thanks, Nitin.
Thank you, Amanda. So just with an eye on the time, I'm going to dive right into juggling the different questions coming in from the chat and the Q&A box, some of which have been responded. So it's great to see the engagement in the chat, but just to bring some of them out into the panel. One of the questions from earlier was from Benjamin Kwasi on data within the agricultural sector, where it says, we think data infrastructure is needed to build resilience for smallholder agriculture. So the challenge is more than data. The challenge is for soft infrastructure. Monica, I noticed that you were starting to respond to that later on, but perhaps a few thoughts on this point of the soft infrastructure that is required.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was replying because I think that I mean in the research that has been done on the enabling environment for private sector investments in adaptation, data at the right granularity level is really important, right? Because I think private sector, they are facing the effects, but they need to be able to make the investment case to their management, and we're still missing I mean data that would enable, for example, a company like Danone or the rest to show what investment cases. So, and that would be kind of like the technical enabling piece. Then we need also the financial, and I think most climate funds have been working on them by having financing facilities, or you also with the African Development Bank. And then there is the institutional piece where those governance structures and the replicability also that Richard was talking about. There is, I think in the last one is where we still need to do so much more. But data and the other, they come together, right, in those structures. So I agree, it's not the only one.
Okay, thank you. Then perhaps one for Jim and potentially also Richard, if you could come in on this. But from Ilya Azarov, how is prioritization measured? Financial asset damage, human life safety metrics, or economic capacity risk? But on this question of metrics, Jim, and then Richard, perhaps from the private sector side, how is it that you're measuring risk or monitoring risk within the investment side of this question? Jim.
Yeah, no, great question, because we've heard all of this emphasis on prioritization, but it's not easy. And the principles of adaptation prioritization are well known. We adapt in order to reduce the risks, the impacts from a changing climate in the future. And any adaptation option involves some cost in the broadest sense, maybe a financial cost, maybe an opportunity cost, maybe a political cost. So we're weighing up a number of different alternatives and wanting to prioritize them on the basis of how much bang we get for our buck, if you like. That's not difficult for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is hinted at in the chat is that there are many different aspects of benefit which we're concerned about. Economic dimensions, climate risks to people, to the environment, but also co-benefits. What benefits could we get from nature-based solutions have been mentioned already in terms of ecosystem restoration, carbon sequestration, and so on. What benefits for people, including in infrastructure, employment benefits. So we need to be valuing costs and benefits in the broadest sense. And that's not easy from a valuation perspective. It's not easy because there's so much uncertainty about the future. So part of the prioritization problem needs to be around robust prioritization. Which of the alternatives are we reasonably confident will perform acceptably well across a wide range of possible futures? And then the final point to make is saying that perfect prioritization is not enough on its own. This needs to then be translated into action, into finance, into implementation, into the relevant governance frameworks, like around regulation, cost recovery, operation and maintenance, which are all really important for ensuring that benefits are actually delivered in the future.
Okay, and Richard, any additional thoughts from your perspective?
I would just add that in the factors the questioner put forward, health and safety of workers and users of infrastructures is always going to be number one consideration for us in the existing operation of a plant and thinking forward of planned improvements. Beyond that, I think typically with infrastructure, what you're trying to avoid is interruption in service or degradation in that service. So although it may cost a bit more to make some adaptations, it can be very costly from both a financial and a sort of wider economic and community impact perspective to have prolonged interruptions in service because you can no longer cope with the conditions. So that's when you're thinking about designing out risk of landslips. Flooding is the obvious one, where you're just going to put some stuff up a bit higher and recognizing that it's likely to be more flooding. We are doing it already. I remember in a more recent investment we made, the cables in the solar farm are buried deeper, right? Because you're going to assume more landslip, washing away because of more extreme sort of weather events going forward. So stuff like that just tries to make sure the thing is performing as it's meant to, and it's called quite boring and not maybe so. As Jim says, you're not necessarily going to get all this perfect, but you're kind of trying to do as much of that as possible up front. And and it's generally serving not just financial, but also kind of output factors, but those two things are linked. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. With a sharp eye on the time, let me just at least ask one more question from Julian Wright from FCDO, saying, I'm very interested in what activities from donors such as the UK might make the most difference in delivering resilient infrastructure at scale. Are we getting it right so far? What tricks are we missing? Linus, I wonder if you might have some thoughts on that, or Mr. Mohammed.
No, indeed, I think we have to keep, it's an incremental process, it's iterative. We have to keep learning and sharing good practice and learning from what we've done already. But I think, again, having this structured way of doing, ensuring that resilience is built is extremely important, driven by policy, guided by regulation, and then motivated and pulled by investments, I think is extremely important. But again, getting it right will mean that we have enough capacity to do it. And I just put on the chat box, Nitin, I mentioned about our initiative, the AfriRes. There is a big training program which is free, which is being offered through our center in EDEP. So I've just put it in the chat in case people are interested, they could go through that process too. But we really need a partnership approach to build the capacity so that we can, it can become main course and not a very highly expensive thing. But also, I think the African Development Bank used to do something very important, project preparation facilities. And I think this is how we need to start thinking on how funds like the Green Climate Fund and so on could support project preparation facilities in institutions like the bank and others, so that resilience is already built in right at the beginning in new projects. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think you saw everyone nod when you mentioned project preparation facilities, because that's the starting point of designing the infrastructure that is required. I see additional questions, but including from Dominic and others in the chat, but we are running out of time, so we will follow up. There will be more engagement through the questions you are asking, but let me thank everyone for joining us on the call today. As a very brief wrap up, you know, what I think is maybe sort of the organizing principle of a lot of the discussion has been around the need to assess climate risk and hazards for infrastructure systems and services, most importantly. So in that one, prioritizing what do people need out of these infrastructure assets. From that, then planning investments, and that can include, for example, what is required around project preparation, but also what Jim referenced around prioritization. So, you know, with maybe a core message of we can't make everything resilient, or we can't afford to make everything resilient. So we do need to plan exactly how to reduce the risk while at the same time doing it cost effectively. And then finally, finance. Because all of the plans in the world are not going to bring resilience about unless we are actually changing something on the ground, and the finances is what allows that to happen. So with that, let me thank our panelists for taking the time today. And if I may speak on behalf of the panel, you know, we have experts discussing these issues today, but we also know that the people listening in have a tremendous amount of expertise. And so we don't see this as sort of a one-way knowledge exchange. We really hope that today's dialogue facilitates additional conversations with everyone who has a stake in this discussion, this very important discussion around climate change and adaptation. From GCA's side, we really want to thank the UK government for all the support in these adaptation dialogues and for the AAAP. With that, let me close the dialogue today and thank everyone for participating.